Hi everyone, I'm here to present my final project for COMM 616, which is an extension of a project I started a few weeks ago on public discourse ethics and public accountability within the world of the X-Files. So if I haven't already lost you on that one, let's get started. The FBI is a federally funded and controlled governmental agency whose domestic investigative priorities include counterterrorism, counterintelligence, organized and violent crime, and the prevention of public corruption. Their efficacy is contingent upon pursuing these goals as a unified collective. But what if the organization were to become fragmented and itself suffer from corruption? Within the fictional world of the television and movie franchise The X-Files, two FBI agents uncover an insidious plot inside the FBI with roots that extend far beyond their own chain of command. The shadow organization the agents expose adheres to its own rules, prioritizing its own goals, which conflict with the public goals of the FBI. While The X-Files is, of course, not based on actual events, the story suggests that if organizational corruption occurs, it would bring with it a unique set of communication ethic quandaries. The presence of corruption in any public organization that claims to act in the public's best interest renders the organization ineffective. So what techniques could be employed to prevent such corruption? Is it possible to limit the threat of organizational corruption entirely? Utilizing a universal humanitarian ethical framework with a theoretical focus on public accountability, I posit that a federally mandated framework of regulation that applies to all organizations that serve the public good, combined with rigorous policies of transparency on behalf of the organization, could mitigate or even prevent organizational corruption. Bosworth explores this issue within the current model of the VA fiduciary program. Fiduciaries are individuals who are legally entrusted to manage the assets of others, may be contracted privately to manage veterans' incomes if the veterans are deemed unable to do so. Lack of regulation and oversight on behalf of the VA, according to Bosworth, has allowed the approval of fiduciaries that are incompetent or unsuitable. Bosworth proposes third-party monitoring to increase transparency in order to prevent this kind of system abuse, as well as national standards for regional offices. Scabiter discusses President Obama's pledge to increase transparency in the federal government through his Open Government Memorandum. Scabiter advocates for requisite releases of information on an organization's decision-making process and performance, with a two-step accountability procedure comprised of a mandatory explanation and a punitive action. One way for the federal government to avoid transparency is privatization, according to Bunker and Davis. Despite their management of public interests, private organizations are accountable to their owners and shareholders instead of the taxpayers because they operate on a for-profit basis. Private orgs are exempt from much of the federal regulation regarding transparency under the Freedom of Information Act, and many private businesses have successfully blocked public access to their records as a result. Bunker and Davis recommend a public function analysis that would determine whether a private org is providing public services and subject to federal transparency regulation. Brown also discusses how private contractors are exempt from the methods used to hold the government accountable. Contract terms govern private contractor performance, while the government is accountable to an administrative hierarchy based on constitutional ideals. She points to Blackwater as an example of a private corporation performing a national security function on behalf of the federal government. Brown argues that these groups should be expected to uphold American public interest while abroad in the same way as members of the armed forces. She suggests that private orgs increase transparency by making the identity of its members publicly accessible and informing the public how grievances can be filed against the organizations. Absent from the literature is an exploration of the ethical considerations that invite organizational corruption, namely how individuals negotiate and prioritize their competing goods, how these choices influence corruption, and whether bureaucratic controls are an effective deterrent. So I'm going to explore these a little bit in my analysis of the X-Files Fight the Future. I approach this problem from a universal humanitarian ethical communications framework. Within this framework, Arnett, Fritz, and Bell state that the goal of an organization serving the public should be to discern and subsequently fight to defend the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In the case of the X-Files Fight the Future, the FBI and the corrupt shadow organization have conflicting ideas about what the public good is and fight to protect those goods in different ways. As Arnett et al. Point out, quote, challenges arise when rival goods compete for our allegiance. The challenge of organizations that seek to protect the public good is establishing what the largest agreed upon goods are and which methods of defense are approved by that public. Public accountability is a vital part of public discourse. If the public grants an organization power by asking it to take on certain responsibilities in the public's stead, that organization is accountable to the public for its actions. And if the organization doesn't employ approved methods or its efficacy rates are lacking, the public has the right and the responsibility to call the organization into question. There are three communicative commitments involved in public accountability: diversity of ideas, engagement of public decision making, and the willingness of an organization to explain its communication choices to the public. The X-Files Fight the Future depicts a complex world of fragmented allegiances within a public organization. Conflicts arise between the FBI mainstream and the shadow organization, between the two main characters, Agents Mulder and Scully, and between other individuals and groups, both public and private. The storyline provides many demonstrations of the variables that influence corruption and what deterrents might be effective. So as an intro, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the intricacies of the X-Files mythology, I'm going to provide a very brief synopsis for you. Okay, so the X-Files tells the story of Agents Mulder and Scully, FBI operatives assigned to an obscure division of the FBI called the X-Files, case files that investigate unexplained phenomena. Agent Mulder believes that his sister was abducted by aliens when they were children, and his quest to find her brought him to the X-Files. Agent Scully is a medical doctor by training, assigned to the X-Files to debunk Agent Mulder's work. Over time, she comes to believe Agent Mulder's story. During their time on the X-Files, Mulder and Scully discover that a secret group called the Syndicate is working from within the government, manipulating the FBI hierarchy and others to further their own agenda. The plot involves a partnership between the Syndicate and an alien race that works against the good of the American people. So the X-Files Fight the Future begins after Mulder and Scully have been reassigned. They are assisting SAC Darius Michaud with a bomb investigation at a federal building in Dallas. They locate the bomb, which SAC Michaud says he can disarm. Mulder and Scully have the building evacuated. Michaud fails to disarm the bomb, and the building explodes, killing him. When they return to Washington, D.C., instead of accolades, Mulder and Scully are brought before a review board to answer for their actions. They find out that several other bodies were discovered in the building. Mulder encounters a doctor, Dr. Alvin Kurzweil, who claims that the bomb was allowed to detonate to hide evidence of an extraterrestrial pathogen that had invaded the bodies left in the building. He also claims that the Syndicate and the alien race are secretly orchestrating Armageddon. Mulder and Scully return to Dallas to investigate further. They discover fields of corn with large white domes. Seemingly empty, these domes in fact house thousands of bees. Mulder and Scully manage to escape the bees and then are chased out of the fields by helicopters. After returning to Washington, Scully is stung by a stray bee and goes into shock. Mulder calls 911, but the call is intercepted. Scully's kidnapped by men posing as EMTs, who shoot Mulder and leave him for dead. He manages to sneak out of the hospital and encounters a member of the Syndicate known only as Well-Manicured Man. Well-Manicured Man gives Mulder Scully's location and a vaccine that can save her life. After explaining all that he knows about the Syndicate to Mulder, Well-Manicured Man kills himself. Mulder travels to Antarctica to rescue Scully. He finds her in an underground facility. The facility is an alien spacecraft, which other members of the Syndicate are conducting experiments in. Mulder finds Scully submerged in water with a tube down her throat. He administers the vaccine, which transfers from Scully to the rest of the facility, causing it to collapse. Mulder and Scully escape back to Washington. Upon debriefing, almost all the reports dismissed by the FBI, with one exception: a vial containing the bee that stung Scully, which is enough to prompt the X-Files reopening. So the fictitious world of the X-Files provides many micro-examples of individuals struggling with the competing goods and how their decisions affect the struggle on a macro scale. But essentially, Agent Mulder is primarily driven by the search for his sister, the exposure of the conspiracy of which she was a victim, and the prevention of further conspiratorial activity on the part of the Syndicate. This quest has extended to include defending and seeking justice for Agent Scully as well. Agent Mulder prioritizes this good above all others. Once reluctant, Agent Scully now shares in his prioritized good. Although they are members of the FBI mainstream, Mulder and Scully engage in activity that runs counter to that deemed acceptable by the FBI. For example, they return to Dallas to pursue their investigation when they're ordered not to. These actions could be considered corrupt and according to the value system of the FBI. However, Mulder and Scully's knowledge of the Syndicate's conspiracy and their actions to protect the public by working to expose the conspiracy places their version of the greater good above that of the FBI's well-intentioned idea of the greater good. Simply put, Mulder and Scully advocate greatest good for the greatest number. By contrast, the syndicate is a group of men who work to both deceive the public about the plans for their demise and to protect themselves from meeting the same fate. The syndicate disregard the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the sake of its own well-being. Despite or perhaps because of this, the syndicate itself falls victim to corruption. Well-Manicured Man, one of the more influential people in the group, struggles throughout the X-Files as he negotiates his competing value systems. He's questioning his role in the conspiracy and the selfish values that contribute to his involvement. Later on in the film, when we see Mulder encountering Well-Manicured Man, and Well-Manicured Man explains the syndicate's plans to him, he admits to Mulder that he was ordered to kill him. Instead, Well-Manicured Man describes the conspiracy in its entirety to Mulder, quote, for the sake of his own children. His life becomes forfeit because of his betrayal, and instead of killing Mulder, he takes his own life, sacrificing himself for the greater good which Mulder fights. The syndicate wields an exceptional amount of power and influence and is able to use this to their advantage. It's here that we see a manipulation of the discrepancies between the public and private sectors. Members of the syndicate utilize official channels of the FBI and the government, as well as employing private organizations. The syndicate, working in tandem with the aliens to orchestrate an invasion, are required to do the scientific legwork to prepare for the takeover. They utilize private research firms and agricultural resources to conduct their scientific research. The use of nondescript resources, such as bees and corn crops, for nefarious purposes help to maintain public trust, and diversifying between the public and private sectors helps the syndicate avoid accountability through the administrative hierarchies present in the FBI and the state and federal governments. With no official channels for inquiry and little knowledge of their activity, the syndicate is able to avoid public accountability. Branches of the public sector are equally manipulated by the syndicate. We learn that Dr. Kurzweil and Mulder's father were recruited by the Department of State for what they were told was a biological warfare project. Unknowingly, they began doing work within official military channels on behalf of the syndicate. Other organizations that serve the public are used by the syndicate as well, including FEMA, as mentioned by Dr. Kurzweil, and emergency services when Mulder calls 911. So holding an organization accountable for their actions is difficult when the organization lacks a discernible identity. When Scully gives her narrative at the final hearing, one official tells her that, quote, most of what she finds here is lacking a coherent picture of any organization with an attributable motive. Avoiding a concrete identity is a goal of the syndicate for this reason. Corruption cannot be blamed on an organization that operates from within other organizations. But as another OPR official explains to Mulder, quote, blame has to be assigned somewhere. Organizations that allow room for corruption to occur invite others to use them as both sources of power and as scapegoats. Bunker and Davis's suggestion to create more cohesion between private organizations that perform public functions could reduce the room for corruption. If these private organizations were classified and treated in the same manner as public organizations regarding regulation and information access, transparency and accountability would increase. The opportunities for individuals within organizations to prioritize their own goods over that of the organization can be managed by extending the accountability protocols of the government to private organizations that operate in its stead. Some of the questions that I found this research raised for me that'd be interesting to study further include the nature of corruption and whether small-scale corruption breeds into a larger-scale problem. So is it possible to contain corruption once it's emerged, or is it all pervasive? Does it translate from one public service to another inevitably? Do the people who commit corruption look for opportunities to commit corruption, or do the opportunities themselves tempt people into corrupt activity? All right, so there are my resources for your viewing pleasure. And I really appreciate your time and patience, and remember to trust no one. Thanks a lot for listening. I appreciate it, and I hope you all have a great long weekend.